is episode 16 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, and now, apparently, a podcaster. I tell stories about martial arts. Let's get right to it. I want to discuss a few recent items that have been in the news lately, starting with UFC fighter Bryce Mitchell's recent public comments saying he liked Adolf Hitler. Now, this sort of stupidity is nothing new from Mitchell. He's made all sorts of bizarre and repugnant comments in the past. He said he's homeschooling his son because he's scared the public schools will make him gay. He believes the U.S. government stages mass shootings so they can confiscate everyone's guns. He said Elon Musk is the Antichrist and is trying to destroy humanity. Okay, that one might actually be true, but that's beside the point. Now, Mitchell has tried to backtrack on what he said in this podcast he did and claim that he really believes Nazis were actually evil. But he said what he said. He said that he thought Hitler was really a good guy and just wanted to kick all the greedy Jews out of Germany. And the bottom line is, Bryce Mitchell seems to be a very ignorant and reprehensible human being. I say seems to be because a lot of these guys do like to put on an act and say ridiculous stuff just to get noticed, like a pro wrestler trying to play the heel. But in this case, even if he was just putting on an act, he's crossed a line in a lot of people's minds. Of more interest to me here was Dana White's reaction when asked about Mitchell's comments. Of course, he said he didn't agree with Mitchell and that Hitler was one of the worst people in history. Real controversial take there, but as he usually does when one of his fighters says something racist or homophobic or otherwise awful, Dana said he's a believer in free speech and he doesn't want to censor anyone. On the face of it, if that was a 100% consistent policy and what I believe to be the sincere belief of him and the UFC, I could probably accept it. But in reality, that kind of free speech policy seems to be a little selective. And I'll say up front, the few times I've met and talked with Dana White professionally, he was always very polite and cordial to me, and I've always seen him be that way with fans who approach him. I have nothing personally against him. Other journalists who have been around him a lot more than I have may have had very different experiences, but my limited experiences with him were always very positive. I'll also say I think he's a brilliant promoter and probably more responsible than anyone on earth for the success of mixed martial arts as a spectator sport and consequently as one of the most popular martial arts being practiced by people around the world now. That being said, I can't say I fully believe anything that publicly comes out of Dana White's mouth. They say people talk out of both sides of their mouths. It seems to me like Dana White can talk out of 8 sides of his mouth. His mouth is the octagon. He says he believes in freedom of speech, yet a couple of years ago at the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I know an American UFC fighter who was appearing on a show after the invasion wanted to bring a Ukrainian flag into the cage to show his support for Ukraine, but for reasons that were never fully explained, he did not do that. In fairness, Russian fighters on that card were also prevented from bringing their flag into the ring. I think it became the policy then to just not allow any national flags into the octagon, but this American fighter then said he wanted to just bring a peace flag into the ring, and he was apparently forbidden from doing that. And perhaps not coincidentally, the UFC is popular in Russia. They've held fights there in the past, and a lot of their top fighters are Russian, so they have a financial incentive not to anger Russia or Russians, even if that means restricting free speech. Now, when I was writing a story for Black Belt magazine on the reaction of the martial arts world to the Russian invasion, I contacted this fighter to ask him about the whole incident, which had already come out in the news, so it was nothing new. But he said he wasn't discussing it anymore. I don't know this for a fact, but my suspicion is that it was not entirely of his own choice to no longer discuss the topic. And I don't think that's anything unusual. My impression is that the UFC takes a somewhat dim view of their fighters, negatively discussing company policies, or pay for that matter, in public. So, where is your absolute freedom of speech there? Besides which, I know of journalists who have been called out and chewed out by Dana White over stories they've written that were negative towards the company, and I know of journalists who have been outright banned in the past from receiving press credentials after writing things the company did not care for. So when Dana White says he believes in freedom of speech, I take that with a very large grain of salt. He may well believe in freedom of speech, and I don't have any reason to believe he's a racist or a Holocaust denier or anything like that. But what it seems to me, as an outside observer, to be is that Dana White believes in freedom of speech as long as it does not hurt the UFC's bottom line or his control of the company and its policies. If something looks like it will interfere with the UFC's bottom line, then my opinion that Dana White's commitment to free speech becomes far less absolute and may even disappear completely. Now, the proof of that would be if large numbers of people suddenly started boycotting the UFC over Bryce Mitchell's comments. If they were getting far fewer people showing up in the arenas or buying their pay-per-views, I'd be very curious how far Dana White and the UFC stood behind Bryce Mitchell's right to freedom of speech then. Now, do I think this is likely to happen? No. The average UFC fan does not strike me as socially conscious enough to care about taking a stand on this sort of issue. They never have before when fighters have made other controversial comments, so I doubt they will now. I might even go so far as to say a certain segment of the UFC fan base even agrees to some degree with Mitchell's comments. There have been a number of news stories in recent years documenting ties between mixed martial arts and far-right hate groups. So yeah, I'm skeptical that there will be a significant reaction to this by the UFC's fan base. Maybe I'm wrong and maybe the fans will surprise me. I'm not hopeful though. But Dana White doesn't have to wait for a boycott. He doesn't have to wait for public opinion to really build up on this. He doesn't have to wait for an opportune moment to quietly get rid of Mitchell, which he may eventually do anyway. Even if Dana truly believes in freedom of speech, the UFC could say that some things are just so far beyond the pale and are so out of line with their company's beliefs that they've decided to take action and cut Bryce Mitchell from their roster. For all I know, they might do this before I manage to post this podcast. They could have done it already, but they haven't. You know, there is something to be said about just doing the right thing, and it would be nice to occasionally see that from the UFC. Another topic in the news recently, or maybe not recently, but back in December, and I haven't really had a chance to comment on it since then, is the case of Daniel Penny, who was found not guilty by a jury in his murder trial over choking a man to death on a New York subway train. For people who might not be familiar with the case, a black man named Jordan Neely boarded a New York subway train ranting threateningly, and many of the people on the train apparently felt fearful of him. Neely did have a history of mental illness and violent assaults. Penny, who is white, along with several other passengers, moved to restrain Neely, and Penny, a former U.S. Marine, used a rear chokehold he learned as part of his training in the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, or MCMAP, which is the Marines' hand-to-hand combat training. We had Kelly McCann, who was instrumental in originally creating MCMAP, on the show a few months ago. You can go back and listen to that podcast if you want. I think it was episode 3. Anyway, Penny grabbed this man in a rear chokehold while a couple of other passengers helped hold him down, and Penny seemingly kept the chokehold on him for too long, and Neely died. Penny was arrested and tried for murder and was acquitted in December. Now, there have been a lot of people making comments on this even well before the trial even started. People from both sides of the political spectrum were alternately saying Penny was a hero, Penny was a racist vigilante, both of which I thought were rather silly since the full facts had not come out at the time and people didn't really know what kind of person Daniel Penny was. And I'm sure the trial changed no one's mind. If you liked Penny before the trial, you still liked him, and if you thought he was wrong in what he did, then probably his being found not guilty did nothing to change your opinion. But I would wager none of these people sat there in the courtroom through every minute of the trial or read every word of the trial transcripts. They didn't look at all the evidence, let alone they were not there in the subway when this occurred. All they know is what they saw on an incomplete 1-minute clip of phone video footage of Penny applying this chokehold and what they brought to this with their own preconceived notions of right and wrong, which probably have very little to do with the facts of the case. As for me, I know nothing about Daniel Penny beyond what I just said here. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. I don't know if he was just trying to be a good Samaritan or if he's a racist. I know nothing about him, and honestly, I haven't tried to find out more. I also am not by any means a legal expert. I may know a little bit more about self-defense law than the average person, but I definitely can't speak on its nuances, so I can't comment on how the law applied in this case or whether the jury's decision was correct. What I can comment on with a little bit of expertise is what I saw in the video clip of Penny choking the victim. And I didn't go out of my way to watch this video. I don't have a particular desire to watch videos of people being choked to death. I might never have seen it, except when the incident occurred way back in 2023. People kept asking me about it, so I finally found the clip on YouTube and watched through it a couple of times. And all I can say about this incident is to offer my own views as a martial artist with a decent bit of grappling in his background on just what I saw there in the video. First of all, if you watch the entire video, early on it appeared to me like the victim might have momentarily lost consciousness as he was being choked and then immediately came back to consciousness. I don't know if that was in fact the case, but it would not surprise me if it was, because that's not a totally uncommon thing in applying chokes. You'll occasionally see it in mixed martial arts fights where a fighter looks like he might momentarily go limp and then suddenly starts resisting again. And that could be because he did briefly go unconscious, but the fighter applying the choke suddenly eased up on the pressure or changed the angle of his grip, which caused the choke to loosen slightly, and the opponent wakes up before the referee realizes he's out. If that was the case, I could see that possibly having a continued effect on the victim. Possibly that could make him more susceptible to getting choked unconscious a second time immediately after that, and might even possibly make him more susceptible to suffering some sort of negative effects from being choked out a second time. I'm not a medical expert either, but in my experience grappling and being around this stuff, that seems a reasonable possibility. Regardless, the victim continued struggling and Penny continued applying the rear chokehold. An important point to remember is that Penny was behind the victim all throughout this, laying back with the victim's weight pressing down on him. At some point, the victim went unconscious and remained unconscious. Penny kept applying the chokehold even after it appeared the victim was unconscious on the video. Now, anyone who's applied a chokehold in that position, which is a common one in grappling where you're behind an opponent laying back with your arm around their neck choking them, and the opponent is laying back with his back pressed on top of your chest, anyone who's been in that position knows what it feels like to have that dead weight laying on top of you. And when a person is laying on top of you like that, resisting a bit, and suddenly stops resisting, if their weight remains on top of you, it's very easy for you to feel like that they're still resisting you, even when they're unconscious, because all their weight is laying on you, which usually isn't that comfortable. So you could easily think the person is still resisting, and therefore you should keep choking him even when they're unconscious. I know this from personal experience. I first started training seriously in grappling and shoot fighting, which was kind of a proto-MMA way back around 1992. I was in the gym one day and my instructor was teaching me how to do a rear chokehold. I think I'd probably learned it in other places before that, and I think I was already training grappling with him for a few months at this time and had probably learned the basics of it from him before this, but wasn't very expert with it yet. So on this day, he was drilling me over and over on the rear choke, and there was only one other person in the gym at the time. I think his name was Andres, but he was a little older gentleman, probably around 40, which was much older than most of the people training there at the time. This was well over a year before UFC 1, so not many people were interested in training grappling or mixed martial arts at that time. Mostly it was just young, dumb kids like me. So, being an older guy, Andres was always trying to prove himself and show he could keep up with the kids, and he developed the attitude that he would never tap out. I think that ended with him getting his shoulder completely torn out because he refused to tap to a shoulder lock, and I think that might have been the end of his martial arts career. But in any case, the instructor had me practicing this chokehold on Andres, and I got behind him, blocking in the rear choke and pulling back until I was laying on my back with him on top of me, facing away from me, in pretty much the same position Daniel Penny found himself in on the subway train. And I locked in the choke and started squeezing as hard as I could, and nothing happened. Andres didn't tap, so I let the hold go and looked at my instructor and asked what I was doing wrong. The instructor told me nothing. Andres is just being a dumbass and not tapping out. He told me in that case I should just keep choking him. So I get in the same position again and start applying the chokehold the same way. And this time I see Andres' hand come up like he's about to tap out, and I hear him make a small gurgling noise in the back of his throat. And then he doesn't tap out, he just lowers his hand. So I keep squeezing as hard as I can, trying to make him tap out, when the instructor says, very nonchalantly, "He's out." Remember, I'm on my back with Andres laying completely on top of me but facing away from me, so I can't see his face. And with his weight laying on me like that, it absolutely felt like he was still resisting, so I'm thinking to myself, no, he's not out, he's still fighting. I've got to keep the chokehold on. But the instructor says again, "You can let him go now, Mark, he's out." So I finally let the hold go, and Andres slumps down off my body to the side, and I look at him, and his eyes are rolled back in his head, and he's not moving, and my first thought was, holy crap, I killed the guy. I looked at the instructor and say, "What do we do?" And he says, "Nothing, he'll wake up soon." And I asked, "Are you sure we shouldn't do anything?" And he said, "Well, we could take Andre's clothes off and leave him outside in the alley like that for fun." But we decided not to do that, and after a few seconds, Andre woke up with no clue what happened. He said the last thing he remembered, he thought he was laying on his couch at home falling asleep, and the instructor told him, "You got choked out because you were too stupid to tap, you dumbass." But what I learned from that is how easy it is to not realize someone you're choking is unconscious when you can't see their face and when their weight is laying on top of you like that. The other thing I learned, which the instructor clued me in on afterwards, was that when people are getting choked out, right before they go unconscious, they will frequently make a small gagging noise. And I've noticed this anytime I've choked someone out and they weren't tapping. You hear them make this small gurgling noise. And usually when I hear that from someone I'm choking in the gym, I immediately tell the person, "You're about to go out, tap." And anytime they haven't tapped immediately when I've heard that noise and told them to tap, they've always gone unconscious within the next second or two. Now, being aware of that gurgling noise and using it as a warning sign is something I've never seen taught in any other grappling gym since then, but it's something that should probably be taught anytime a person learns a chokehold, because it is easy to not know when someone is out and to keep that chokehold on after they're unconscious, which can clearly have negative outcomes, including someone dying, which is what happened here with Jordan Neely. But there's more to this, because at some point, Penny seemingly did realize the victim was unconscious. It's at this point you can see him on the video talking with the other people who were restraining the victim, and while he's talking, he's still applying the chokehold. And I don't know that he had any malicious intent doing this because, first of all, it's a very intense, stressful, chaotic situation. So it's possible he didn't even realize he was continuing to choke this guy as he started communicating with the other people assisting him. And I don't know what was said. Again, I didn't bother to read the trial transcripts on this, but I can imagine Penny might have been discussing what they should do with this guy when he lets the chokehold go if Neely regained consciousness and started fighting them again. Maybe they were discussing if they should tie him up somehow. I don't know. But continuing to choke someone after they are unconscious is a definite danger. The question for me is just how aware Penny was of that danger. And to a lot of people, especially expert grapplers, it seems obvious that you would know choking someone after they're unconscious is highly dangerous. But when you think about how many people we watch get choked out on TV in the UFC and get up and walk away perfectly fine, it's not that surprising that a lot of people underestimate just how dangerous continuing to apply a chokehold can be. And yes, Penny did have some training in Micmap. I think his trainer from the Marines even testified in the trial and said Penny did not do the hold properly. But my question would be just how much the importance of immediately letting go of a chokehold after someone goes unconscious was stressed in that training. I'm sure it was told to Penny and the other Marines, let the hold go after the person goes out. But was it really stressed to them over and over the potentially fatal consequences of keeping a chokehold on for too long? And I can say my experience, having been in a lot of different gyms that teach chokeholds over the years, is that very few of them really emphasize the potential dangers in a chokehold. Again, like with recognizing the gagging noise, I was fortunate because this was really emphasized to me when I first learned grappling. But it was a little different back then. I won't say instructors knew more because grappling has evolved and in some ways is probably more sophisticated now than it was years ago. But there are also a lot of basically young kids or young adults teaching grappling now who may not be as experienced or at least may not have quite the same perspective or concerns over the consequences when it comes to something like this. When I first learned grappling back in the early 90s, we were also taught some resuscitation techniques, what they call katsu in judo. These are methods that you can use to wake someone up if they don't immediately regain consciousness after a chokehold. The main one I learned was just sitting the person up a little and massaging their neck. I also learned giving a slap to the back of the neck, and there are others I've seen placing your knee against their spine and giving a little pull backwards on their chest. I've never had to do any of them because if you do let the chokehold go right after someone falls unconscious, they almost always wake up on their own within a few seconds. But I have seen other people use these resuscitation techniques effectively. People used to line up for my old friend Judo Gene LaBelle at the end of his seminars to be choked out by him. Why they did this, I don't know, but he was happy to oblige them and would put out a dozen people in a row, but would always make sure they came back to consciousness right away, usually just by rubbing the back of their neck or something similar. But I can't remember the last time I saw a resuscitation technique taught in a grappling gym was, or even mentioned. I'm sure some places still do it, but I don't think it's anywhere near as common knowledge as it used to be, nor do I think really emphasizing the potential dangers of keeping a chokehold on too long is being talked about enough in modern grappling gyms. So like I said, I don't know what was in Daniel Penny's heart back when this occurred. I don't know what was going through his mind. I know he was legally acquitted of any crime by a jury, but I also know that choking people is potentially dangerous, and if you're going to do it for real on the streets where there is no instructor or referee to call stop, you should probably be well trained in not just how to choke someone out, but in how to not kill them. And that is the responsibility of the instructors teaching this stuff. Finally, I saw a news piece recently on CNBC International about virtual taekwondo. I'm not going to talk too much here about virtual martial arts. I think they're fine as a game for kids to play and may even have some benefits as a training tool for real martial artists. I think as a full martial art and a replacement for actual sparring against a live opponent, it's ridiculous. If you're doing any form of martial art that requires a sparring component and you're scared to square up to an actual person in that live sparring, you probably just shouldn't be doing that martial art. But like I said, that's not really what caught my interest in this story. What I found of interest here was in the introduction of the story, what the reporter said right at the very beginning of the piece that Taekwondo originated in Korea more than 2,000 years ago. Well, they were close. Taekwondo originated about 70 years ago. So the reporter was off by only about 1,930 years in their reporting. Having been involved in both the journalism world and the martial arts world, I've seen this going on way too much over the years, and you see it to a large extent across the board in journalism when it comes to reporting on any sort of somewhat obscure, specialized knowledge which we can consider martial arts to be. The reporter in this case probably knew nothing about Taekwondo. She either took what one of the Taekwondo people she interviewed told her at face value, or she just Googled Taekwondo and believed the first thing she found online. In either case, this is an example of plain bad journalism in not checking your facts. And yes, it wasn't really germane to the main points of the story, but still, you see this far too much in journalism, particularly in mainstream media, when they try to cover martial arts. And you see it far too often even among journalists, historians, commentators who do specialize in covering martial arts. What people know about martial arts, or what they think they know about martial arts, usually falls into the category of what historians call invented tradition. This is a false narrative that develops after something is invented, which usually tries to attach a more ancient or more impressive origin to how that tradition started. And this invented tradition gets repeated enough that it comes to be accepted by most people as what actually happened. And invented tradition occurs in many, maybe all realms of human endeavor. Sometimes it's because no one knows the actual facts of how something originated, and human beings aren't comfortable with those kinds of gaps in their knowledge, so someone invents an origin and everyone goes along with it because no one knows any better. And sometimes these invented traditions are invented even when the people inventing them know the truth. And maybe that truth isn't very impressive or noble sounding, so someone comes up with a more impressive and noble origin story, and subsequent generations just don't know any better and simply repeat this origin story until it's accepted by everyone as fact. And this is the deal with almost all martial arts and martial arts history. If you're the average martial artist or martial arts fan, then pretty much everything you ever heard about martial arts history is probably bullshit. I know people don't like to hear that Kung Fu did not originate with peaceful Buddhist monks in the Shaolin Temple. They don't like to hear that there were not these mystical clans of black-clad ninja running around assassinating warlords in ancient Japan. They don't like to hear that karate did not start because ancient Okinawans had their weapons taken away and had to learn how to fight Japanese samurai barehanded. They don't like to hear any of this stuff. They like the romantic version of martial arts history, even when it has no basis in reality. In the case of Taekwondo, its origins are pretty clear to anyone who wants to do a bit of research and bothers looking at what the better historians have to say about it. The Koreans were originally doing karate, mostly Japanese Shotokan, but after World War II, Japan and Japanese things weren't very popular in Korea. The Koreans were trying to build a sense of nationalism. They started calling the karate they were doing by alternate, more Korean-sounding names. The most popular of these names was Taekwondo. That had the most political backing at the time, and that's what the main Korean martial art came to be known as. And yes, they modified it quite a bit from its karate origins until it became its own unique martial art that's now very different from karate. And that's all fine. That's a perfectly acceptable origin for any martial art. But that was not a satisfying enough origin story for Taekwondo people in Korea, so they began trying to come up with a way of claiming a more ancient lineage for it based in Korea. The most common way of doing this was to claim that even though it might have had some minor karate influence, it also was heavily based in Taekyon, which essentially seems to have been a traditional game Koreans would play on the street where they'd try to knock each other down by pushing them over with kicks. And Taekyon was all but extinct by the time people first started using the term Taekwondo in the 1950s. If it had any influence at all on Taekwondo, it was extremely minor. But it sounded like a good story, and it flattered Korean nationalists' sense that they were doing a traditional Korean art form rather than a Japanese art form. Now, there's a lot of history we simply don't know about martial arts, and we should be adult enough to say and accept we don't know something when we don't. But there are some things that are factually known about martial arts, and when that's the case, then the facts are the facts. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people don't seem to want to know the facts, and people can't even discern what facts are anymore. They want to come up with their own facts, which may bear no relation to reality, and then convince other people that those facts are actually the truth. I don't say that everything is known about martial arts or about any other facet of human knowledge, but I will say some things are known. And maybe people with an interest in a particular subject should take the time to try and learn those things about it truthfully and honestly. That's all I've got for today's show. We'll be back in a few weeks with another episode. I'm hoping to have Greg Thompson, who is the founder of the Special Operations Combatives Program and teaches hand-to-hand combat to the U.S. Army Special Forces, on the show next time, if we can align our schedules. I want to thank Eleanor Academia for providing the music to the show. You can find a link to her website down below. You can find a link to my own website down below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep punching.